Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
We're doing a series on your approach to Islam. And of course, we have to talk about the Quran, Dr. Shabir. So, Dr. Shabir, where do you place the Quran in terms of its primacy within the Islamic sources that we have?
Right on top. So,
Okay.
as we discussed, there are four commonly stated sources of Islamic law: the Quran, the Sunnah, which is information we get from the Hadith, Qiyas, which is scholars'
Analogical
evaluation
reasoning.
and analogical reasoning, and Ijma, usually placed before Qiyas, which is consensus of opinion after many scholars have used their judgment and they arrive at a kind of a consensus and agreement among them. So the Quran is always placed as number one by everyone. But I often feel that while in any discussion the Quran is mentioned first, it is there as a formality, whereas the ruling actually comes from something else. It may be something mentioned in the Hadith, it may be something mentioned by an Islamic scholar, it may be something mentioned by a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or so on. And what is mentioned in the Quran is there, presented, but as a formality, and then the wording is just ignored later on when we arrive at the crunch of delivering the final verdict.
Can you give us an example, Dr. Shabir?
Well, if we look at the question of stoning for adultery, every once in a while we are jolted by news that in some part of the world there are some young men setting up an Islamic State, and to prove that they're really serious about doing this, they catch someone that they accuse of adultery and they stone that person, often a female. And then, we're wondering, where does that come from? Because when you're reading the Quran, you don't find that it says anywhere in it that the adulterer should be stoned. Of course, there are verses which say that the adulterer should be flogged. Most notably, one particular verse, the Quran, Surah 24, verse number 2. But there are other verses which seem to, collaborate with that. But basically, it's carrying forth the same ruling. For example, in the fourth chapter of the Quran, in the 25th verse, there is a stipulation that if a slave, a person who was not free, and in that society they did exist, not desirably so, but it was just simply tolerated in the early phase of the Islamic history. So if such a person were to then get married, and then she committed adultery, then she would get half the punishment that is to be meted out to the free person in her similar circumstance. So how do you halve the punishment of the free person? If the punishment of the free person was stoning to death, it's not going to work. Like, how do you get half of death? But sometimes we say that the person is half dead, but in Islamic law, you needed something definite. But if you're starting with 100 lashes, which is what is prescribed in Surah 24, verse number 2, for the adulterer and the adulteress, then half of that would be 50 lashes. So that's even Steven. So from the Quranic perspective, it is clear that there's nothing like stoning for adultery. And where does that come from? It comes from another source, from Hadith. And people have used that, and they've trumped the Quran with the Hadith. Whereas Hadith is important. It's reports about, the Hadiths contain reports about what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said or did or acquiesced in. Some of that is authentic, some of them not authentic. And even if it reports something that he did, maybe he did it before the verse of the Quran was revealed, which I believe to be the case here. He might have followed a Jewish practice prior to this, but when the Quran came and said 100 lashes, that became the rule. But some people remembered the graphic scenario of somebody being stoned, and they reported that as though that were the ongoing rule. So to look carefully at this, I would start with the Quran, and I would give primacy to the Quran, and I would not let the Quran be thwarted by something that is of a secondary level of authority.
So how did you mentioned the Hadith, was it just the Hadith that was used, to trump the Quran, or were there other things, like, for example, traditional stories that were known at that time?
There would be all of this, but usually those traditional stories would be couched in the form of a hadith. It would be presented that, this is what we noticed in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Or it would be said, that was the ruling, and Abu Bakr continued with the same ruling, and Omar continued with the same ruling. And then there is even a story that says that there was a verse of the Quran that prescribed this. So now this
that got lost somehow.
yes. So John Burton, has written a lot about this. He said that, well, people are now trying to foist this into the Quran. They don't have a verse in the Quran that says that this is the rule, but they want that to be the rule. And if the rule is not there in the present Quran, they want to imagine that it was in the Quran prior to the collection of this Quran as we have it now, but the verse just was not included. And so there's even a whole story about Omar performing the pilgrimage, and then in the midst of all of these pilgrimage rites, suddenly out of the blue, he comes up to make a public announcement that there used to be a verse of the Quran that spoke of this stoning, but it was not included. But I just wanted you to know that there was a verse, and had I not feared that you would accuse me of adding something into the Quran, I would have put it in. So imagine this scenario where Omar is even contemplating, you know what, I could put it into the Quran, but I just won't because I don't want people to accuse me like that.
So I guess the issue is like the authenticity, right? The Quran we know is authentic, right? It comes from God. And then there's hadith and stories, and these things are, lesser in authenticity.
Yes, and you can
so
see,
if that trumps the Quran, then that's a problem, right?
Yes, and you can see how this latter story is not authentic, because it might not even be Omar's saying all of this. Somebody else is trying to justify a later scenario where they are stoning and trying to say that, okay, it must have been in the Quran. And even Omar acknowledged this. You see, so it's a later story.
So how difficult, Dr. Shabir, do you think it is to change that perspective, to make the Quran of primary importance in terms of the sources? And what impact do you think that would have on the Quran in terms of like specifics?
Yeah, well, it's not difficult if people would really think about it. It's only difficult because people don't like change in general. Like, if you're in a workplace, people like to do the thing the same way they've always done it. And, it was probably Einstein who said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again while hoping for a different result. But some people do that. They just want to do the same thing over and over again. And they don't like change. They resist all change. But if Muslim scholars are really scholars, then they would welcome change, because they know that change has been like throughout the generations. There are some things, of course, which remain static, like the basic principles of Islam, but some things do actually change over time and have been changing over time. And Muslim scholars were actually at the helm of prescribing change when they saw that there was a need for it. So we shouldn't go willy-nilly just, trying to change things just for the sake of changing them. But this is an important principle, like the idea that the Quran is primary. This is what everybody acknowledges. It's just that somewhere, we forget that the Quran was supposed to be primary, and we give primacy to something else. And it will have a lot of implications, of course. It will affect a lot of rulings once we start revising like this. But many of this will be for the betterment. For example, the idea that the apostate should be killed. This is a major problem in modern thought. Like, how is it that Muslims are killing people? Where is the freedom of conscience and freedom of religion? But the Quran does not prescribe this. In fact, on the contrary, the Quran shows that people in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were reneging from the faith, and right there under his nose, when he had authority over them. So he could have executed people for reneging from the faith, but he didn't. And the Quran is showing that people are even toying with the faith in this way, embracing Islam in the morning, reneging by evening, in order to make other people waver. So they couldn't have been playing that game if the Prophet, peace be upon him, were executing people for reneging from the faith. And that shows that, it's a later sort of idea that was foisted onto the Muslim community. And to uphold that idea, one has to ignore what one reads in the Quran.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome. Support us today and help us share the message of Islam with people across the globe. Thank you, and may God bless you and your loved ones with the very best always.